On April 4, 1980, 11 Puerto Rican men and women were arrested in Evanston, Illinois.
"11 Puerto Ricans were arrested in Evanston, Illinois. They were charged with conspiring to overthrow the authority of the U.S. government by force of arms and sentenced to 55 years to life in prison. They pronounced themselves prisoners of the undeclared war between the U.S. government and the Puerto Rican people, therefore refusing to recognize the jurisdiction of the U.S. government."
The independence movement in Puerto Rico didn't begin with the capture of 11 Puerto Rican prisoners of war. It has a history from the moment that the United States invaded Puerto Rico 86 or 87 years ago. There has always been armed insurrection.
What follows is a visual display of the arrest and subsequent demonstrations, through sub-zero temperatures to blazing hot sun.
Back here in Chicago, Carlos Torres and 10 other suspected members of the Puerto Rican terrorist group, the FALN, appeared in court today. Torres, who was the FBI's most wanted fugitive, and the others were arrested Friday in the Chicago suburb of Evanston. Julie Eckert has more.
The courthouse was surrounded by policemen and sheriff's deputies, armed with shotguns, handguns, and rifles. They kept their eyes on about 40 demonstrators who chanted their support for the suspected terrorists. Anyone who tried to go inside was carefully searched. One by one, the 11 suspects were dragged or carried into the courtroom as they shouted nationalist slogans. The 5 women and 6 men were charged with theft and weapons violations. One of their leaders, Carlos Torres, had been number 1 on the FBI's most wanted list. He told the judge, "I am a freedom fighter. I am a prisoner of war. U.S. justice is a lie." 3 of the suspects have now been linked with the FALN raid on the Carter campaign headquarters in Chicago. The FALN has also claimed responsibility for more than 100 bombings in several cities. The 11 suspected terrorists were arrested Friday night in Evanston, Illinois, after police received a report of a stolen van. Police said they found a cache of weapons. Just what the suspects were doing in Evanston is a mystery. The suspects entered no pleas today and were taken to a Chicago jail for better security. Authorities say these 11 arrests may cripple the FALN organization. Julie Eckert, ABC News.
On February 18, 1981, they were convicted of seditious conspiracy.
The FBI says the Chicago-based FALN is America's most dangerous terrorist group, waging war on America for Puerto Rican independence. But as Paul Hogan reports tonight, the FALN fights in part because the U.S. government countered terrorism with some terrorism.
Well, the government anyway, Ron. They're called the Puerto Rican police murders. And while they occurred a decade ago, investigations continue to this day of how police reacted to nationalist violence with violence of its own. Rolling hills turn into mountains in the middle of Puerto Rico, dividing the island in half. Atop one of the highest peaks, Cerro Maravilla, are these communications towers. Here, 10 years ago, Puerto Rican police announced they had killed 2 nationalists, terrorists trying to blow up the towers. An undercover police informant was with them and wounded in the reported shootout. The pro-statehood governor then, Carlos Romero Barceló, hailed his policemen as heroes.
Most people applauded this as a worthwhile action.
Even so, newspaper reporter Manuel Suarez had his doubts. It took him years to help uncover what really happened to the 2 young men who are memorialized in stone on this mountaintop. And when the truth finally emerged, some of those who believed this small territory of the U.S. should be an independent nation had another reason to wage war on America. Puerto Rican nationalists who committed acts of terrorism in Chicago and other U.S. cities over the past decade often cite what happened here atop Cerro Maravilla, Marvelous Mountain, as a spark that led them to commit their acts of violence.
There was more than enough evidence to indicate that the police were lying.
que ya uno gritaba.
The police story began to unravel when reporters talked to the taxi driver who was forced at gunpoint to drive the three youths to the mountaintop. He identified the gunman as the police informant and said there was not one but 2 volleys of shots from police.
Okay, pues muy bien.
Suarez began to get calls from government sources who said police and top government officials were hiding the truth.
This was not a good cover-up. This was not a good crime. You know, either the FBI, the biggest amateurs in the world, or that they participated in the cover-up.
Only with the recent release of FBI internal documents through Freedom of Information is it clear why federal agents didn't crack the case. The FBI San Juan chief argued against Justice Department intervention because it would undermine the credibility of Puerto Rican police and hinder the Bureau's bombing and terrorist investigation efforts.
Finally, in November of 1983, one of them tells how the young men were actually killed.
Even without federal pressure, one of the policemen broke down during hearings conducted by the Puerto Rican Senate. Then a few others got immunity and confessed.
It was pre-planned that they would be killed.
It was the police informant who lured the 2 youths to the mountaintop where they were arrested, tortured for a while, and then executed.
It's state terrorism. I don't think there's any other way that you could describe it.
The governor was voted out of office. Top police officials were replaced. 7 policemen have been convicted. 2 more are now on trial for the killings. The informant was murdered in the streets. Manuel Suarez has written a book all about it, and the Puerto Rican police have been writing about him.
Yes, it turns out that I show up on a list of subversives, and I don't know what I'm subverting.
Well, Suarez is not alone. According to Senate investigators, fully 3% of the Puerto Rican population is on the police subversive list. Tomorrow night at 10, how nationalist beliefs entered Chicago with the wave of immigrants 40 years ago, eventually spawning the FALN.
Carlos Alberto Torres was not offered clemency. Oscar Lopez Rivera refused the offer.
The FBI believes it has jailed the leadership of the FALN and therefore seriously damaged the Puerto Rican independence group's ability to wage war on America. But as Paul Hogan reports, there's a Chicago minister who's lost 3 members of his family to this prolonged conflict, and he would disagree.
Around the first wave of Puerto Ricans who migrated to Chicago in the 1950s brought with them the political divisions that are part of the island's history. It was their children who grew up here who became the FALN.
I am very proud of my son.
Reverend Jose Torres' only son, Carlos, is serving a virtual life sentence in federal prison. So is Carlos's wife, Heidi. Reverend Torres' wife, Alex, is also in federal prison.
My wife, I love her.
Reverend Torres raised his family preaching one message, nationhood for his island home.
Puerto Rico is our own country. Puerto Rico is little, but it's something that we love and that we have to defend.
Reverend Torres' son, Carlos, who was raised to be what he became, was one of those held responsible. Heidi Torres' fingerprints were found on one of the killer bombs, and the government says Reverend Torres' wife conspired with them. Why bombs?
To call the attention in a drastic way, in a way relevant, that in a language that is understood in every nation of the world.
In Puerto Rico, the vast majority votes for candidates who favor continued U.S. ties. Those who seek statehood for the island dismiss the FALN as irrelevant.
Some people are violent in every society, and they have different causes. If not, they will invent one.
Even though Puerto Ricans here in Chicago revel in their heritage and take pride in their distinct nationality, there appears to be little support for FALN tactics. And though he favors independence, the status question itself isn't even on the agenda of Alderman Luis Gutierrez.
If I pushed Puerto Rican independence as an issue for Alderman Gutierrez, I'd have a lot of difficulty in the neighborhood in terms of making some economic and social gains here.
And yet, there is a long history of violence on both sides of the status question. From the assassination attempt on President Truman to the attack on Congress, all the way to the FALN.
I think that we have the spirit and the will to fight, and so we have not been defeated.
Never get out alive, but that's the price they appear willing to pay for acting on their beliefs.
You cannot love something or someone unless you want to give your life for that. My boy, Carlos, he loved mucho.
Well, there's a bill pending in the U.S. Senate to make Puerto Rico the 51st state if, by ballot, the people on the island vote for it. But most parties agree there's no majority that would agree to moving in either direction. So this 90-year-old conflict is almost certain to continue.
Thanks, Paul. He's a reputed terrorist, a man convicted of leading an underground war on America. His headquarters, Chicago, where only last week he was convicted of plotting his own prison escape. In the second part of a series of reports, Paul Hogan tonight brings us an exclusive interview with the man the FBI says is the leader of the FALN.
Well, how and why did Oscar Lopez Rivera change from a Vietnam War hero to an underground bomber who committed acts of violence for an idea, Puerto Rican nationalism? Because he says, though he values human life, he hates oppression more.
I do not condone violence for the sake of violence.
Oscar Lopez is a planner. He's an organizer. He is a bomb maker. He does perpetrate terrorist acts himself.
I have every right to wage struggle in Puerto Rico and in the United States by any means necessary, including armed struggle.
And armed struggle it was for Oscar Lopez Rivera and the FALN. From the mid-70s onward, over 100 bomb attacks that killed 5 innocent people.
They are very violent. They've dedicated their lives to overthrowing the United States government in the sense of liberating Puerto Rico from control of the United States.
Now serving sentences that, if carried out, will keep him in chains until he dies, Lopez believes the fight to free Puerto Rico from U.S. control requires war on America.
I've always been a Puerto Rican nationalist. I will never trade my Puerto Ricanness.
Lopez was born 43 years ago in the interior mountain town of San Sebastian. His mother says their home was simple. No money, but food for every guest and love for all. On one wall, a wood carving of Che Guevara. On the other, John F. Kennedy.
Siempre he sido fuerte.
When Oscar was 13, he and his father emigrated to Chicago. She followed a few years later. They ended up in West Town, where tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans were migrating to escape the island's poverty.
I always remember him questioning my grandmother.
His brother Jose says Lopez grew up challenging authority. Nevertheless, when he was drafted out of college, he went to Vietnam, to the front. So, also on his mother's wall and in her hand, Oscar's Bronze Star.
Vietnam was a big change in me.
Lopez became a social worker, fighting, he says, for the rights of Puerto Ricans in Chicago. But he soon concluded that the above-ground independence movement was failing. He blamed the now documented counterintelligence program launched by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and the well-financed statehood party movement on the island.
And as a result of that, we decided that it would be best if we develop a different strategy, a strategy that would give us an opportunity to keep an above-ground structure and at the same time work underground.
So Lopez and other Chicago nationalists went underground, bombing their way into the headlines, ending up behind bars, self-proclaimed prisoners of war.
I can contribute.
Lopez now writes and does pencil drawings from his prison cell. He is enshrined on the walls of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center in West Town. His wife, Ida Luz Rodriguez, was jailed too as an FALN bomber. They have no regrets.
I mean, I live to see it, but we will succeed. We will succeed.
We have approximately 20 of their members incarcerated at the present time, and most of them for very lengthy prison terms, to the extent they will probably never get out of prison alive.
Never get out alive, but that's the price they appear willing to pay for acting on their beliefs.
Today's events commemorate the historic arrest and celebrate the continuing resistance of Carlos Alberto Torres and Oscar Lopez Rivera. It is a call to our collective conscience, a call to action, a call to bring them home.
Para hacer nuestro destino, por el bien del universo, con la música y el verso nos tiramos al camino. Adiós al pensar mezquino que mata a la humanidad. Vamos a hacer la unidad amiga o amigo. Si tu amistad nos regala, si en las buenas o en las malas podemos contar contigo, bajo el fraternal abrigo del respeto y la igualdad, vamos a la eternidad que nos sigue prolongando por el mundo, convocando la cumbre de la hermandad. Óyeme, sí, la cumbre de la hermandad. Albergamos la esperanza de hacer un mundo mejor donde se imponga el amor al odio y a la matanza. Sabemos que el tiempo avanza, que es mucha la adversidad,